So a warm welcome to all of you joining us online today. My name's Jodie Evans and with me is my colleague, Associate Professor Carol Gill. I would like to begin this morning with an acknowledgement of country. As we gather today, physically dispersed, but certainly connected virtually, let us take a moment to really reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we meet. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work and live, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this workshop today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of our Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria. We're really pleased to host the first workshop today in our new Women in Leadership series. Today's workshop will focus on how to manage difficult conversations, and our subsequent workshops will feature Amanda Sinclair really sharing her wisdom on how we can meaningfully reflect, but try and do that without judgment and self-criticism. And then our final workshop for this year will be with Mara Olekans talking about how to feel good when negotiating and how to negotiate successfully. So a few little housekeeping points and a bit of an agenda for today is that the way our workshop will run is we really want to get you involved and give you opportunity to ask questions and talk. So the workshop will run for about...
Dialing into the webinar.
Just asking everyone to mute themselves as they join. So we'll run for about an hour and we'll conclude at 11 a.m. Carol will spend around 15 minutes outlining some frameworks and approaches to help you manage difficult conversations more effectively. Now we'll record that section of the workshop, but we'll stop recording when we get to the interactive Q&A part of the workshop. So you don't need to have any concerns that that part will be recorded, but we wanted you to be able to have Carol's content after the workshop as well. It's often hard to write everything down so quickly. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, and we certainly encourage you to have your cameras on, but it's not a problem if you'd prefer to turn them off. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions, to share your experiences, and we'd ask you to do that by raising your electronic hand, and then we'll call on you and ask you to unmute. You can also submit questions or comments in the chat function. So just to give you a little bit of a sense about today's workshop, as I previously mentioned, my name's Jodie Evans. I'm an Associate Professor of Marketing at the Business School, but I wear another hat where I'm the Program Director of our Women in Leadership program. So as a business school and also as a learning community, we've had a long-standing commitment to building the confidence and capability of women to lead effectively in organisations and in the communities that they serve. And we're really proud of our legacy in this space, particularly with our really successful Women in Management dinner and also with the Women in Leadership executive program that we launched a few years ago. Given everything that happened this year with the changing operating model for the school, and as we pivoted and moved so much of our content online, we made the difficult decision to postpone our residential executive program for women this year. But it's actually given us an opportunity to expand our reach. So that program normally brings 25 women into the school for a really immersive week together. But what we're able to do now by putting this series online is actually expand our reach, and we have about 150 people with us already this morning. So this is where I guess we're learning and innovating as a result of COVID. In talking to women over the past few months as we developed this series, a number of topics and issues have come up as women navigate the competing roles that they have at the moment, as we work from home, but also as we live where we work. And so with that has come increased sources of conflict and tension, and really challenges around how we navigate our roles at this time. And so we were receiving a lot of questions and sort of people seeking advice from the school about how to manage these complex situations, and particularly how to manage difficult conversations, either as the instigator of a conversation or as the recipient. So we had a lot of questions around, how do you even initiate a conversation right now when you might be feeling mistreated or exploited, but also somewhat uncertain about your employment? How do you say no to a superior at the moment? How do you manage difficult conversations remotely? So this is certainly one of the big topics that came through. Is we're used to having these difficult conversations in person, and so how do we do this well when it's mediated through technology, either through Zoom, whether it's text, whether it's email? How do you have these difficult conversations with someone virtually? And also, what do you do afterwards when there's no opportunity for that next casual interaction where you might bump into each other in the office? How do you manage those next interactions virtually as well? And so this is the focus of our discussion today. And I'm really delighted to be able to showcase the expertise of my dear colleague and friend, Carol Gill. Carol's an associate professor of organisational behaviour here at the school. And she has deep expertise in leadership, in human resource management, and in organisation development. It's quite a privilege to work at Melbourne Business School and be able to access the expertise of my faculty colleagues. And Carol's particular approach to managing difficult conversations has helped me so many times in my own leadership roles. And I practice her techniques all the time. And so I'm really thrilled, Carol, that you're able to join us today and share your advice and frameworks to help the community of women that have joined us this morning. So Carol, over to you to start talking through these approaches.
Thanks, Jodie. It is a real privilege to be here today, and I can see Amanda on the screen and some of my colleagues, and it's lovely to be part of a community of women at Melbourne Business School, where we're trying to make a difference. So that's great. The only other person I want to acknowledge is my daughter, who, as a teenager, gave me lots of practice in managing difficult conversations. So, now I'm just wondering if we can have the slides up that I had prepared. Okay, so this is just going to be 15 minutes. It's mainly going to be the frameworks, and I'll try and give some illustrations on the way through. But I'm really looking forward to our question and answer session to really put some currency of our current situation with COVID-19 into this particular presentation, which really was something that I'd prepared in different times. So I'm looking forward to that so we can get to your questions. But I want to start off with this idea of mental models. And it's a really important idea, and it's really important for women as well. And it's important to realize that there are facts, and then there's a story around the facts. So that's number one. And this is both positive and negative. And women are often being, I don't want to use the word victim, but have the mental models around women have been changing over the years. I'm a baby boomer woman, and they were very different when I was a younger woman and growing up. But they're still perhaps stacked against us largely, because often the powerful actually are the ones that determine shared mental models. What is the mental model that we're going to go with as a society? And the views of women still are somewhat archaic, and we buy into those mental models as well. You know, we shouldn't ask for what we want. You know, nice girls don't ask, and those sort of mental models we have to break free from as well. And this is particularly important for difficult conversations, because often we're shadow boxing, if you like. We think we're working with facts, but often we're not. We're working with people's interpretation of the facts, and we've got to elicit it. And that then brings me to my next slide. So if I can get that changed. And this is the framework we're going to use. I've used it for a great many years. I don't even want to think. It's probably 40 years I've been working with this now. And it's a very simple model, and it does take the emotion out of having a difficult conversation. And just to give you an idea, on the left-hand side, there's a very simple problem-solving model, but it's an important model. And so the first step is defining the problem, and that's where we need to dig deep into mental models. What are people's thoughts about what's going on? And sometimes we'll elicit more facts too, which is very valuable. But we certainly need to define this problem, the real problem, before we move to brainstorming solutions, because otherwise we're solving the wrong problem. And so that's something that's really important. And then we're going to evaluate and select a solution, obviously, or a series of solutions in collaboration with someone else. And finally, we're going to plan and follow up. And that step 4 is very important, because remember my story, my advice on mental models, people change them all the time. And it's good because we can be really, we can affect others with what we say and what we do. We can give them a different sense of what's going on because mental models are changeable. But people can snap back after a discussion with us and remember things differently. And so if we just jot down an email, great to meet with you, and I'm glad we were able to discuss the X, and I'm glad we were able to agree Y. And then we're clear, we haven't forgotten. And then there were 2 skills I want to work with today, and that is advocacy and inquiry. Now, advocacy is where we share our mental models with others and facts, we say why we hold this model. And then the inquiry side is really around how we inquire into other people's mental models. What do they really think? Let's get it all out on the table. So I'll move on to the next slide now, and we'll go into each of the skills. So inquiry, if you came to the Women in Leadership program, we would be working with this extensively. I would be role modeling it for you, and you would be practicing it on each other and thinking about your own situations. But for now, let me just give you a high-level view of this and maybe some illustrations. But this idea of getting the next question from the last answer, it's such a powerful tool. It not only clarifies what's gone before, it keeps the conversation going, it helps people feel that they've been heard and listened to as well. And so if I were to ask you just any question, I might say, why have you come to this webinar? And you might say, oh, well, I've got a problem with my boss. Immediately, I can go from there with perhaps an open question would be a smart thing for me to ask. What sort of problem? Okay. And then you might say, oh, my boss won't listen to me. And I said, well, what do you think's going on there? And I'm eliciting from you your mental models. Okay. So I'm always listening to do that. Many of us actually are thinking about ourselves when people talk, rather than thinking about what are they really saying and where will I steer this conversation next. Now, there's lots of research on this. Asking questions will get you a better job or even a second date if you want one. The other thing is that it's very effective. And then the next slide, I'll show you a graph, if we can move there now. And what you can see here is that people who asked more questions were liked more, and people who asked less questions are liked less. So that's really important. So let's move to the next slide now on the next skill. And this is advocacy. And this is a very effective technique if you do a lot of performance management for others or you have direct reports. But also you might have to give feedback to your boss or your peers from time to time. And this takes the anxiety out of it. We call it effective conflict. It's a conflict where you're blaming someone's personality. So I might say to my boss, I think you're too domineering. That's not very useful for my boss, and it would make my boss quite defensive. So instead of that, I would ask myself the question of, why do I think my boss is domineering? You know, and when did I first identify that? And so it would be much more useful for me to say to my boss something, and I would probably be very careful with my boss, depending on the relationship you have. I would probably use the royal we, whereas if it's a direct report, I wouldn't do that because it's a different in power. But I might say at our client meeting last week, we failed to convince the client that we were the best provider. And the impact of that is the client is now considering going elsewhere. And presumably the boss would say something along the lines of, well, you know, what's going on? Why would that be the case? And then I would go into something like, the client, at that meeting, the client felt we weren't well prepared. Now, I had prepared, but there were a number of others at the meeting, including yourself, who perhaps didn't have the kind of information that I had to hand. And I didn't share that wasn't given the opportunity to share that information. The impact of that is the client felt we were unprepared. So you can start to see me using the situation, the behavior, and the impact. And I have an illustration on that slide as well. And this is educational, right? This is developmental. This is focusing on something that isn't about the person being domineering at all. I mean, that might be the case, but that is actually a mental model. It might be that that our boss comes back to us and said, I had no idea. I'm sorry. Or our boss might say, well, why didn't you speak up more? Right? So now we've got a different mental model to work with. It's now about me speaking up more in meetings. And maybe that's right. And maybe I'll take that on board. So let's go to the next slide and see how we might take on board that kind of feedback in a non-defensive way. So if I can retrofit this model now, can't I? And this comes from the Center of Creative Leadership, a very well-known and well-regarded organization. So when I'm receiving feedback from my boss that I might not be assertive enough, I could say, well, what would a good assertiveness look like? Could you give me an example at that meeting when I could have spoken up? Now, this is all me in inquiry mode, but you can see I'm eliciting someone else's mental models about me. They might say, oh, well, maybe if I didn't speak so much, you might have had that opportunity. They might get self-insight, and they may not. But at least I'm actually not shadow boxing now. I'm really getting the truth out of this situation. The other thing is, think about how accurate it is. It's only one person's view, maybe a very important person, but nevertheless, it is one person's view. And you need to hold it as a hypothesis and test it out with others if you want to, you know, go somewhere else and say, is this accurate? Did you see this? You were at the meeting too. What went on for you? You don't have to take it on board. It's just another piece of many pieces of information coming at us. So we'll move on to the next slide. And I'll pull it all together in a moment. And this is the slide where I'll do that. Okay, so how would a conversation run, a difficult conversation run? So the first thing is defining the problem, and we're going to use the SBI technique, the situation, behavior, impact, and a new behavior. So this is how I'd like someone to behave if I can do that. That's me adding that on, but it's helpful. It's more even educational to say not only what it was that went wrong, but what it would look like if it went right. Right. So this requires a bit of preparation before the meeting. And I've got positions and interests there, and that's a common negotiation technique or framework, and I'm sure my colleague Mara will probably talk around that. But really, you know, someone will hold a position in a difficult conversation, but we really want to go behind that position and say, why are they holding that position? You know, what are they really motivated? What is their real story behind that position they're holding? So I might start, if I were initiating the conversation with advocacy, I might say, I called this meeting because I wanted to talk to you about our client meeting last week. And then I might give some SBI. If it didn't go so well, the client's thinking of going somewhere else. I'm still using situation, behavior, impact. But then I'd go into inquiry. And I'd go, what are your thoughts on this? How are you feeling about that? That's if they haven't given it to me. They might immediately jump into advocacy, but they may not. What do you think the causes are for this problem? And we will start to tease it out, just like we started to look at. You know, there is my boss is too domineering. My peers didn't give me any airtime. I'm not assertive enough. People didn't prepare well enough for the meetings, all sorts of different causes that we will elicit. when I feel that what we call in qualitative research, we've reached saturation, there's nothing else to be said, I'll probably summarize. That's how I usually move between the steps. So I'll say, okay, so we've agreed that this is the problem and these are the likely causes of those problems. I'm just wondering what we might do about it. Now, I'm always going to inquiry before I go to advocacy. Now, there's a reason for that. When people are involved in the process, they become committed to the outcome. Also, we gather more information, but beyond that, we now have a collaborator rather than an opponent. And I will then go to advocacy if I have to. But if the other party brings it all up, I don't have to go to that, do I? I can just say, okay, it sounds great. I'm going to summarize again. It looks like these are the possible solutions. I become more assertive. People prepare. I meet the client on my own. There could be a whole range of solutions we explore. And then we'll go into evaluating and selecting it. So what would be the best way for us to proceed with this? Where would we begin? You know, I'm starting with inquiry. Often an employer will go, I don't know. And you say, okay, well, let me give you some suggestions. So I'll go into advocacy if I have to, but start with inquiry. And then, as I said before, follow up. Even a follow-up appointment is important. I think that's all I had to share with you about this model. It's fairly abstract, and I think our discussion, which won't be recorded for people who are watching this, will actually tease this out.